Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into one of the absolute most incredible maritime stories of the last 300 years. We're talking about a saga that has a little bit of everything, tremendous wealth, sudden disaster, ruthless pirates, and this ongoing modern-day clash between chasing pure profit and trying to preserve our history. This is the wild story of the 1715 Spanish treasure fleet.
So you kind of have to wonder, right? How on earth are 300-year-old gold coins still washing up on Florida beaches today? Well, imagine taking a casual morning stroll along the water, looking for some driftwood, and suddenly spotting a glimmer of gold in the surf. That is exactly what happened back in the 1950s to a retired Florida contractor named Kip Wagner. He just kept finding these ancient silver and gold coins in the sand. And when he noticed that absolutely none of them were dated past the year 1715, it sparked this relentless curiosity to figure out exactly where they were coming from.
So, Wagner teams up with his neighbor, who happened to be an amateur historian named Dr. Kip Kelso. And together they hit the absolute jackpot. But not in the water. They found it in the archives. Dr. Kelso uncovered this authentic 18th century map of eastern Florida, and it had this very specific kind of chilling notation right next to the Sebastian River. It read, "Opposite this river, perished the admiral commanding the plate fleet of 1715. It was basically an X marking the spot, and Wagner knew exactly where he needed to look. And you're going to love how incredibly scrappy Wagner's step-by-step process was. I mean, he didn't start out with some massive high-tech salvage ship. He went and bought a $15 surplus military mine detector and just started sweeping the beach. Before long, he's pulling up musket balls and then a diamond ring. By 1960, he partnered up with some Air Force and NASA divers to form a real salvage team. And get this, after pulling up 2,000 pieces of 8 in a single day in 1961, they actually named themselves the Real 8 Company. They literally turned a $15 detector into a multi-million-dollar operation.
Part 1. The Disaster, July 1715.
So how did all that gold end up on the ocean floor in the first place? Let's walk through the timeline. On July 24th, 1715, you've got this combined fleet of 12 heavily loaded ships sailing out of Havana, Cuba, heading for Spain. Exactly 7 days later, in the early morning hours of July 31st, disaster strikes in the Florida Straits. They get totally trapped by a massive hurricane with winds estimated at over 100 miles per hour. 11 of the 12 ships were completely destroyed, either capsizing in the deep water or just shattering against the shallow reefs. Only one single ship, a French frigate that had sailed a bit further out to sea, safely made it back to Europe.
But listen, the most crucial point here isn't just the lost gold. It's the staggering human cost. According to Cuban records, around 1,500 sailors and passengers lost their lives in that violent storm. By the time the sun came up, those desolate Florida beaches were just completely littered with wreckage and survivors who had to immediately fend for themselves against the elements while desperately waiting for relief ships from Havana. And the cargo going down with them, it was almost beyond imagination. Spain's King Philip V was desperately relying on the shipment. In fact, a huge chunk of it was this massive royal dowry, intended to impress his reluctant new 22-year-old wife, Elizabeth of Parma. I mean, the inventory is crazy. Over 1,200 pieces of rare jewelry from the Americas, a heart crafted out of 130 pearls, and a massive 74-carat emerald ring. It's just wild wealth that, sadly, Elizabeth never even got to lay eyes on.
Part 2. Pirates and Privateers.
Now, the Pirates of the Caribbean weren't going to just sit this one out. As soon as Spanish authorities set up a salvage camp on the beach to recover their sunken wealth, the opportunists swooped in. By December of 1715, famous privateers turned pirates Henry Jennings and Charles Vane actually captured a Spanish mail ship, forced them to give up the exact location of the salvage camp, and launched a surprise raid. The Spanish were totally outnumbered and had to surrender the recovered treasure. Jennings and Vane walked away with an astonishing 87,500 pounds worth of gold and silver in just one single raid. The audacity is staggering.
Part 3. Modern Treasure Hunters.
Okay, let's fast forward back to today, because the allure of this fleet has absolutely not faded. And the discoveries, they are still happening. On July 31st, 2015, which incredibly was the exact 300th anniversary of the sinking, Brent Brisbane and his company Queen's Jewels LLC found $4.5 million in gold coins just sitting in the shallow waters off Firo Beach. It just goes to show that Florida's Treasure Coast is definitely still earning its name.
I mean, even the 2025 salvage season alone brought up over $1 million in silver and gold coins.
Captain Levin Shavers and his crew unearthed these massive caches, including some super rare olive blossom gold chain links. Now, Florida law keeps a pretty close eye on this stuff. The state actually gets to select up to 20% of the recovered artifacts to keep for the public in museums, and the rest gets divided up among the salvers, so it's a very high-stakes modern business model.
And this brings us to a really fascinating crossroads in how we actually handle these shipwrecks, because we have two very distinct approaches. On one hand, you have commercial salvage, which is driven by profit, backed by private investors, and ultimately results in these coins being sold to private collectors. But on the other hand, the archaeological approach is all about strict scientific data gathering. They leave items perfectly in place until they are mapped, prioritizing public archives over private sales. Both groups are interacting with the exact same shipwrecks, but with totally different end goals.
Part 4. The Science of Shipwrecks.
So let's take a look at the actual science side of things. It's this meticulous, quiet work of underwater archaeology. During surveys like the one on the Nanticoke River, you'll see professionals carefully tagging and stabilizing these waterlogged timbers before they are even moved. Because in archaeology, context is absolutely everything. The exact position of a single timber or one iron nail can literally tell scientists how an entire ship was built and where it came from.
One of the coolest tools they have in their arsenal is dendrochronology. It's a big word, but basically, by analyzing the tree rings on the ship's white oak frames, scientists can match those patterns up against master regional timelines. For instance, they could pinpoint that the wood from the Nanticoke wreck came from the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, and that the trees were cut down sometime after 1743. It's basically a wooden fingerprint. And to get that level of detail, researchers rely on a wild toolkit. Before a single grain of sand is disturbed, they are out there mapping the debris field, using marine magnetometers to detect iron, side-scan sonar for acoustic images of the seafloor, and sub-bottom profilers to see what's actually buried underneath. Only after all that do they move to manual probing, looking for super-specific construction clues like the spacing of wooden tree nails or old pit saw marks.
As you can imagine, the logistics here are massive. Recovering a huge 30-foot intact wooden keel requires tugboats, cranes, and incredibly exact measurements. These pieces have to be kept wet, stabilized, and meticulously recorded. But this rigorous data collection is absolutely crucial. It's what feeds historical institutions across the globe, like the Archivo Nacional de Cuba, helping to identify these exact fleets and preserving the real stories of the people who sailed them centuries ago.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about. As commercial operations continue to pull millions in gold from wrecks like the 1715 fleet, and archaeologists painstakingly map others to protect our collective maritime heritage, we really have to ask ourselves, if the sea eventually gives back all its gold, what happens to the history lost in the pursuit of profit? It's a constant tension between keeping the treasure and keeping the story alive. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it sparked your curiosity to dive even deeper into the mysteries of the deep.